blood off the harpoon head. All right, I'm going to call us to order and get us started. I know there are going to be a few empty seats tonight because I have received a few notices for people being away, but we work on our hearts to forgive them, and that's something we're going to talk about later. We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory here, and that we are in the homeland of the Métis Nations, and probably on stolen land as far as that goes, but we'll get to that. And we give thanks for our ability to live and live out our lives on these lands. So we're going to follow the kind of framework that we followed last time, where we're going to go until 10 to 8, and then there will be a break for you to run down and buy coffee. Mary has set an example by eating dinner downstairs as well, and if the college begins to show an increase in revenues because of this, I'll be very happy. So we're going to deal with treaties. And by the way, I noticed that our concept of the circle is morphing and changing and developing as we go on. I do understand and appreciate that a lot of you want to use the table to write with and write on. So
just don't shake it.
We are gradually reconfiguring in all sorts of ways. But we'll hold to the idea of a circle. Well, yeah. I have to tell you that while in First Nations cosmology the circle is the circle of life and it's internally divided into the four directions, in Inuit cosmology a closed circle is death. That when somebody dies you close off the circles, and if you look in Inuit cosmology there are circles, but there's always a line coming out of the circle. And that line is always a passage, an opening, a way out. So that just gives you a little visual image for a slightly different cosmology there. If you want to learn more on that, you can come and do my course on Inuit. We won't be doing much of that here. So today we were going to talk about treaties. I'm going to start off by dealing with some of the incredibly boring stuff around the history around treaties, which Vince is convinced that I have to do. And then Vince will talk about, I'm not going to speak directly about Treaty 5, but Vince is going to talk about Treaty 5 since that's his treaty, or the treaty which he is a member, or how do you put that? The treaty with which you're associated. Just to back up a little bit, we talked last time about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Just to note that the Royal Proclamation of the 1763 was one of those contributing elements to that little rebellion that occurred south of the border and led to the formation of an independent country called the United States. It was one of the many pieces, and the main reason that the Royal Proclamation contributed to the American Revolution is because it, of course, bounded and restricted the 13 colonies to remain east of the Appalachian Mountains, which is something they did not want to do. And so that was one of the contributing elements. And so with when the Americans won the Revolutionary War, one of the first things to go was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So that's, again, one of the reasons why it doesn't apply in the States. The other little piece just to note from that, which is more important for our thinking, is that the First Nations, particularly the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Five Nations, were extremely conflicted by the American Revolutionary War. They didn't know which side to join or which side to align with, I guess it's a better thing. There were massive debates in the Longhouse during the American Revolutionary War, and it split between those who thought they should support the Americans, those who should support the British, and those who wanted to remain neutral. And it caused quite a lot of division and conflict within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. One of the upshots out of that is that at the end of the Revolutionary War, the British did offer their allies, the Six Nations who were their allies, offered them land in Canada, and that's of course the famous Haldimand tract along the Grand River in southern Ontario. Not much of that large tract is left, as First Nations territory, but it was originally established as the Six Nations Confederacy territory in Canada. Part of the reason that I wanted to talk about that is because that talks about the profound relationship between the British as colonizers, and also the French, but the British as colonizers and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as allies. And that was and is the understanding today of the relationship between the Crown and the Haudenosaunee. Okay? So there are no treaties with any of the Haudenosaunee. They understand themselves and they see themselves as sovereign nations and as allies. And you need to start keeping that in mind as we move into talking about treaties, because not all First Nations in Canada are treaties, and some have quite different relationships to the Crown. That relationship of ally actually remained in place through the War of 1812. That other little incident which Mr. Trump seems to get upset about, the British burning down the White House. One of the things that we tend to forget in our glorification of the fact that nobody won or nobody lost that particular encounter, of course in Canada you're taught that we won, is that in fact on the Canadian side virtually the entire War of 1812 was fought by First Nations on our behalf. They were led by Tecumseh, who was a chief from actually what's now Upper State, Michigan, and he gathered together and united the various tribes in that area and the ones in southern Ontario to fight on behalf of the British against the Americans, largely due to the expansion of the Americans into their own territory. We tend to forget that most of those battles were fought and won by the First Nations. Until 1813, when unfortunately at the Battle of Moraviantown, Tecumseh was killed, and in a fit of, I don't know what you'd call it, his body was chopped up into little pieces and spread out over the battlefield, so Tecumseh was never buried. With that, most of the First Nations that had allied to the Crown then basically went back to their homes. But the importance of that is that with the War of 1812, there's a fundamental shift in the relationship between the Crown and First Nations. In Canada, that's actually represented that up until the War of 1812, the First Nations were always dealt with by the War Department, and after the War of 1812, they were then transferred over, the administration of First Nations was transferred over to a civil department known as the Indian Department. In the United States, incidentally, after the War of 1812, the administration of tribes in the United States was transferred from the Indian Department, which is a civil department, over to the War Department. So the Americans decided to take a decidedly different approach at that point. That shift, which is an important shift from understanding and seeing First Nations as allies, away from that, leads to the treaty making, which we're about to talk about. So you need to remember that shift. And remember that the idea of an ally is that you have two sovereign nations who are agreeing to work together and to fight together. So the very notion of those allied alliances, it holds within it the notion of sovereignty. And as you begin to move away from those kinds of relationships, then the assumptions behind it begin to shift as well. So, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. Their treaty making actually begins in Canada in 1752. That's in Halifax. But the early treaties were basically, and if you look at them, they're more or less straight land for cash transfer. So at least they're understood as land for cash transfer by the Europeans. And those are a whole series of treaties that cover southern Ontario. And there are lots of small ones in southern Ontario, which are basically, as I said, upfront payments for land directly to First Nations and the moving of First Nations onto reserve lands. So that's where you begin to see that model emerging in the 1820s through the 1830s in southern Ontario. Just one little gig which you may not have realized. Canada and the Crown didn't have enough money, and they weren't particularly inclined to actually pay the First Nations for these lands. Okay? So the problem is, how do you pay them? Well, you come up with this great idea called an annuity. So you pay them a portion every year. Okay, a small amount every year. And the way you get the small amount is you acquire the land from the First Nations from a small upfront payment. Then you sell the land to settlers, who of course can't afford to buy it, so they take out mortgages, and they pay mortgages every year to the government, which then becomes the annuity which you pay to the First Nations. So in other words, the government ends up not having to pay anything for it. All right? It was a brilliant plan, saved the government millions and millions of dollars, and is the basis for most of the rest of the treaties. So when you realize that the basis of the rest of the treaties is this idea that you don't want to actually pay for the land, so you want to get somebody else to pay for it and let the money flow through. Great idea, except for one little tiny hitch. The fact is that most of those settlers were, well, I was going to be rude and say they were Irish, but they were poor, and they of course couldn't afford to pay their mortgages, and most of them went bankrupt, and their mortgages were forgiven anyways. So if the settlers aren't paying their mortgages, then there's no money to pay the annuities to the First Nations. So that's where you begin to see the chain breaking down in terms of how the payments and things work for First Nations. So those are the Southern Ontario treaties, and as I said, there are a number of them. The other thing that you should also note is that treaties only come into play when the government or when Western settlers actually want something from the land. Up until the time they actually want it, the government doesn't make a whole lot of effort to actually engage in treaties. The next major treaties are the Robinson Huron and the Robinson Superior treaties, which cover the territory north of Lake Huron, north of Lake Superior, up to the height of land. If anybody wants to know where that height of land is in the middle of northern Ontario, it's very difficult to find. Only the Cree know where it is, because it's pretty flat up there, and it's actually a swamp. So that's why they're called Swamp and Cree. Cree are to the north of the height of land, and Anishinaabe are to the south of the height of land, and so it's covering that territory there. That's because you're beginning to see extensive mineral exploration along the north shore of Lake Superior and Lake Huron, and they're actually discovering mines and fairly significant mineral resources. The Anishinaabe didn't take kindly to miners and geological explorers in their territory, and so they had a kind of nasty habit of burning down their camps and driving them away, which then led the government to step in and bring in these treaties. So the two treaties cover northern part of Ontario. Those treaties are again some of the foundations for the ones that come later on, which we're going to focus on. But the one major difference in those treaties is that they actually include the Métis in those treaties. There were large Métis communities, particularly around Sault Ste. Marie, and they actually include the Métis, and that's something that becomes highly controversial later on with the treaties. So those are the ones that cover Northern Ontario. Well, not all of Northern Ontario, but Treaty 9 covers the Cree area to the north. The next set of treaties are the famous ones that are referred to as the numbered treaties. And so those are the treaties number 1 to 11. 1871 is the first one, starts here. 1921 is the last one, which is basically covers the Mackenzie Basin, that part of the Northwest Territory, that direction. So there's a whole series of treaties. Just to note that treaty making stops in 1921. The government no longer uses that as a policy tool in 1921. And it doesn't start again until 1975 with the challenge by the James Bay Treaty against the hydro project in Quebec. So the first modern treaty, the first modern line of claim settlement is the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975. So there's a chunk of time in there between 1921 and 1975 where the government is not entering into any kind of treaty relations. Okay? Before we go any further, you need to have just noted in the back of your head that there are chunks of Canada that are not included in treaty. British Columbia being the most obvious one. Okay, so most of BC does not come under treaty. A little chunk up at the top northeast corner, it comes under Treaty 8, and there are 6 tiny little treaties around Victoria, okay, the Douglas treaties. But the rest of BC is not covered by treaty, okay. Most of Quebec, until 1975, all of Quebec, most of Quebec is not covered by treaty. Okay, so there are no treaties there until the James Bay Agreement. So none of southern Quebec are there any treaties. The treaties that are that cover the maritime provinces is actually the 1752 Treaty of Halifax, and that one is claimed by the Mi'kmaq, and so there is a treaty relationship there, although the terms of that treaty are a bit different. I should also note that Newfoundland and Labrador are not covered by treaty. Okay, until the land claim settlements there are not any treaties in Newfoundland and Labrador. There were other areas of Canada, like what's now Nunavut, were covered by treaty. So there are large chunks of the country for which there were no treaties, and today there still aren't. Okay, and those are highly disputed. And I should also note that there are a number of groups in Canada who argue that they never signed the treaties, and so there are a number of groups who were missed in the treaty-making process. Well, yeah, the complications around those are really quite interesting. The Lubicon Cree in northern Alberta are one example of that. There's also the group around Monogamy in southern Ontario, another example of that, who were never covered by any of these treaty arrangements, and so they're kind of outliers in the system. So you have to sort of get this vision, envision Canada, and then think about what is and what is not covered, okay, and what implications that might have. So
it seems to me when I was in Ottawa, people were saying we are on unceded
yeah, that would be, actually, you're right. That's also unceded land in that part of the world. Sorry, yeah. I couldn't remember all of them, but there are chunks. Algonquin land territory is another one that's not covered. But that gets you into the complication of borderlands with Quebec there and how far the Ontario ones go up and that kind of thing. So what triggers Treaty 1? Well, what triggers Treaty 1 is the formation of Manitoba, actually. The huge, messy, nasty, complicated history that led to the foundation of our province. And so this kind of brings it rather directly home to you. As we know, the Hudson's Bay Company transferred something. They couldn't have transferred land titles since they didn't have land titles. They transferred something from themselves to the government of Canada. Well, actually, they transferred it to British Crown first, and then British Crown transferred it to Canada. But don't worry about that. Transferred something to Canada, and Canada thought, all right, we've got this home and territory, so we'll exercise some jurisdiction over it. And of course, at which point the Métis who lived here in Winnipeg said, no, we already have our own governance and jurisdiction. Hudson's Bay Company has no right to sell the land to you. And no, we're not going to accept your jurisdiction, and so they wouldn't allow the Lieutenant Governor to enter. That, of course, led to the famous conflict of 1869-1870, which was resolved by the Manitoba Act, okay, which creates the province of Manitoba. Now, things are going to get really hairy here, folks, so just hold on to your seats. The Manitoba Act, one of the things it does is it sets aside 1.4 million acres. Now, you have to remember how big Manitoba is in those days. It's not very big, all right? It's a little tiny chunk of territory. It sets aside 1.4 million acres for the children of Métis heads of families. That's what it actually says. And has some recognition of Métis land holdings in the Red River. Okay. Now the problem, just to note, there was no means in the Manitoba Act to actually transfer this land to Métis, first of all. Secondly, in case you hadn't noticed, minors are not allowed to own land, so transferring 1.4 million acres to the children of Métis families was an entirely futile gesture since they couldn't own it anyways. They didn't seem to notice that. And they put the rider on the property, on the holdings of the Métis in the Red River settlement, that it had to have been recognized by the Hudson's Bay Company prior to the transfer. Some holdings were, most weren't. Okay, so that's piece one. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of First Nations sitting here, largely Anishinaabe, but also Cree, sitting in the Red River settlement, and they say, here, wait a minute, what about us? This is our land too. And don't we get any land out of this deal? Don't we get anything out of this deal? How come the Métis are getting 1.4 million acres and we're not getting a thing? Little problem, especially since the transfer of the Hudson's Bay Company territory said that the Canadian government is obliged to settle any outstanding First Nations claims. Okay? So the Canadian government figures, okay, we've got to do something about this. We've got to make an arrangement with the First Nations. Now, of course, the First Nations in Red River already knew about the Robinson Huron and the Robinson Superior Treaty. Those are their relatives to the east. They already knew about the treaties down in the States, so they knew about what was going on in these other areas. All right. So the Canadian government decides to send out a treaty party to Manitoba. To travel here, they come via Thunder Bay and through that route, and they think that it would be a good idea that on the way, if they negotiated a treaty with the folks in the Rainy River Kenora district. Let's just say things didn't work out well in that negotiation, and it took another 3 rounds to get Treaty 3. The Anishinaabe of northwestern Ontario were not easily convinced by the need for a treaty. So, the treaty commissioners arrived here. We're going to start looking at the treaties. We're going to break up in a second, and you're going to actually look at the treaties with a couple of questions. But the treaty commissioners arrived here to discuss this with the Anishinaabe and the Cree. And they discovered, much to their surprise, that the Anishinaabe and the Cree are prepared to negotiate, and they've got some demands. They're not interested in a straight cash for land deal. They're interested in a much more complex deal. Okay? And they're not prepared to take a straight cash for land deal. And so the treaty commissioners get a wee bit of a surprise, to put it mildly. I think one of the things you have to be very frank about is that we know that the chiefs were, the First Nations chiefs were very, very astute and very apprised of what was going on. They knew that their world was changing around them. The buffalo weren't gone yet, but they were going, that they were being invaded by settlers, and that was a problem. And they had this relationship with the Métis that needed to be worked out, and they really needed to get a handle on things and work out a way to live in this new world. As we'll shortly discover, one of the things that they demanded right up front was agricultural equipment, basically full outfitting of agricultural equipment. The other thing they demanded was schools, and because they realized that their children needed to be educated if they were going to deal with this situation. The treaty, as you will see, and you pick this out, the treaty actually says that the government promises a school on every reserve. That's not what they got, and it's certainly not what happened. What they got and what happened was not what they asked for. But it is really very interesting to see that, I think these chiefs are incredibly forward-looking to say, okay, we gotta get something going here. And so they ask and they demand what they needed. And so the negotiations are actually very tough. They're extremely tough negotiations, much to the surprise of the government negotiators. At one point on the third day, Yellow Quill and all the Cree walk out. They say, we've had enough of this, we're not getting what we want, ta-ta. And they walk out, which leaves the treaty commissioner sitting there going, oh dear, we've got a problem on our hands. And after a little bit of discussion, they sent somebody out to bring Yellow Quill and the Cree back into the discussions. But they were very, very tough negotiations. And so that first treaty is one of the few treaties, Treaty 1, 2, and 3 are the few treaties that came out of very, very hard negotiations. Okay? Unfortunately, once you begin to get onto the treaties after Treaty 3, what happens in that case is that the government in Ottawa basically writes out the treaty in advance, what they're prepared to give, and writes it out in advance, and gives it to the commissioners and says, get them to sign on to this, and that's all there is, there ain't no more. Okay? Now, there are some negotiations, and there are some changes as you go along in the treaties. But they're the kind of tough negotiations that you saw in 1, 2, and 3. The government is not prepared for those, to enter into those afterwards. There are some, by the way, but by no means the same time. So, a couple of other thoughts. Treaties. What is a treaty? That's an open question.
An agreement between sovereign nations.
An agreement between sovereign nations. Precisely. So, and normally under international law, normally under Canadian law, agreements between sovereign nations have to be passed by Parliament. Right? Well, it's true. That's one of those facts. None of these treaties were ever passed by Parliament. They're all executed by order in council. This is where the understandings begin to get complicated. The sovereignty of the First Nations in relationship to the sovereignty of Canada. Canada, by that point, is clearly not upholding the notion of First Nations sovereignty. That notion has collapsed. The First Nations, of course, are upholding their own sense of their sovereignty, and they continue to do so. But that's where one of the real strains and stresses occurs in this. The other thing just to tell you is that there are, of course, huge problems around language. What exactly is being agreed to, and can you say some of those things in Cree? You can, but whether it means the same thing or not is another matter. Okay, you can say almost anything you want in any language, except it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Just so that you remember this, who were the interpreters? No, the government officials didn't speak Cree or Anishinaabe. No. Who spoke both languages?
The children?
No, the children weren't generally part of it.
Okay.
Well, they were part of it, but they weren't part of the negotiation.
The Métis.
The Métis, yeah, the Métis.
The traders.
The missionaries. None of the churches involved in this. The other people who spoke both languages were the missionaries. And you'll find, if you look at the treaty records, that the translators are usually both Métis, who speak a variety of languages, and the missionaries, who speak a variety of languages. So the churches are deeply implicated in the treaty-making process, because they're acting as interpreters. And if any of you have ever worked with interpreters, you know that the interpreters actually hold an enormous amount of power in the situation. They're not supposed to. The theory is that they're not supposed to. They're just supposed to be, one language in, another language out. That's never true if you've ever, sorry, having done interpreting myself, that's never true if you're actually doing interpretation. Okay? I was helping an old Inuit guy sell some carvings, and the folks asked how much do you want for the carvings, and he said to me, and he looked into it, "Amma," which means whatever. Yeah. Brian shrugged his shoulders, whatever, which I translated to $675. What surprised me even more is that the people accepted that. We gave them $675. Woo! But, don't think that the interpreters are neutral, and don't think that the missionary interpreters are neutral in their opinions of what should be going on here. Okay?
Well, there's also like natural, cultural misunderstandings, right?
Right, and they'll carry all of those as well as, well, all the parties carry all of those.
Do you have a sense of what their leanings would have been?
The missionaries?
Yeah.
Well, they're actually, some of them are, it's actually quite an interesting study. I don't want to get into that because that could take us all night. The missionaries are actually quite conflicted because they do understand the place and the needs of the First Nations, but they also assume the cultural superiority of the West and the whites and themselves, and therefore that in fact what the government is offering is a good deal and that the First Nations should go for it. So, but you do read that their accounts, their own accounts are quite conflicted over, because they also recognize what's going on.
So were they having kind of backroom chats with the chiefs and that? Saying,
No, I think they were having more backroom chats with the treaty commissioners.
oh, they were.
Very nice to have tea with the treaty, well, probably, gin and tonic with the treaty commissioners. No, I should give them their CMS missionary.
No. Tea.
Tea, yeah. No, they weren't having backroom chats with the chief. The Métis were. And you see, because the Métis, now this is the other thing we'll get to, and I'll just deal with this up front. One of the things that happens in the treaty making process is treaty only applies to First Nations people. Does not apply to Métis. Métis has a script. They have the land grants, which we already recognize as a problem there. Okay? The problem is, in 1871 here in Winnipeg, where do you draw lines between the Métis and the First Nations? In fact, where do you draw the lines between First Nations, Métis, and whites? The lines are pretty blurry, okay, and pretty complicated. And what the treaties basically forced to happen is that you had to choose. If you chose First Nations, you lined up at the treaty table, you got your $5 and you signed the sheet. If you chose Métis, you lined up at the script table, you got your script paper for a piece of land, and you were Métis. Okay? And that's where the lines start hardening. Now, for the first 30 years or so, there's a lot of shifting back and forth, and if you look at the government records, people are constantly swapping back and forth between being treaty or being Métis script, and the government finally gets fed up with it and said, that's enough, we're cutting it off here, and they cut it off. Okay? But pause for a second. You line up with Vince at the treaty table, you get $5. You line up over here at the script table, you get a grant of 160 acres of land. Unfortunately, they're often in places like Edmonton, which if you're sitting in Winnipeg is a little bit far away. But you got a title to a piece of land. Sitting back where Simon is sitting is, well, actually the companies that later became the great Canadian banks, saying, you got a piece of paper for 160 acres, I'll give you $80 for it here and now on the spot. Now, if you're going to get $5 for treaty, or $80 for script, and basically you got nothing, which one are you going to take? And of course, Simon, having collected thousands of these, then proceeds to go and sell them on the open market. And now we have the Bank of Montreal, Bank of Nova Scotia, the Royal Bank of Canada, all those great companies. Also, CP Rail does it as well. So, Richardson Securities, pardon? Hudson's Bay Company, yeah. They all do it. It becomes a very, very difficult situation, but it forces people to create a distinction between First Nations and Métis that, if I can put it this way, shouldn't have been as hard and sharp as it legally became. Okay? And that's another one of the consequences of the treaty process that you're not often aware of. All right? And the situation is actually very confusing for a very long time over who fits where, until the government, as I said, gets fed up and puts their foot down. Okay, so you've got to do some work now. You've read Treaties 1, 2, and 3. For now, stick to Treaties 1 and 2 since they're very similar. Treaty 3 is a little bit different, and we'll come back to that in a second. I want you to split up into your table groups, or into table groups, rather than the depth of there. And look, first of all, list 3 Crown obligations. So 3 things that the Crown promises to give to the First Nations. And I don't think you'll find 3, but 3 First Nations obligations that the First Nations are obliged to give to the Crown. All right? Go look for it. And we'll go for about 10 minutes and then we'll take a break. Hold on, don't go away. One is that you're probably dealing with, there were different what children and adults received, and the last one is they you want more?
We need a tender for you.
A school.
That's actually, that kind of story is quite common.
$5 to $15
That's
per
what
year.
I'm not trying to get at. The lines
Family
weren't
is $5.
very clear in the 87. And I think that they deliberately didn't want to be clear.
That's the upfront.
Yeah. I think it's except we are right under the
Well, I was going to get to that.
no liquor is that an obligation? Yeah, that's what I get involved
The
in.
use of Indians belonging to the band of
Just the land
So,
itself.
160 acres for each family of 5, or a portion for larger or smaller families. That's included in it.
Agrees and undertakes ways of aside and reserve
Right now, on Amazon, it's $46.
Okay, here's 3 dollars or $5, whatever it was, a school.
So what did they have to give in return?
$3 per person per year. Or that's straight up, that's the first thing.
Oh, yeah, I haven't looked at that yet. I just don't know.
Third thing is the school.
Blankets, clothing, traps.
And then to get back to be
I
perpetual.
mean, all I can come up with is actually setting aside the
Setting aside the land.
Yeah.
It's not page number on the treatment water program.
And went to the first session. Whole bunch more there.
Peace, yeah, land. Peace. So they had to be peaceful.
Should say they have to follow the law, right?
But still, it's as if it has.
Also, I remember reading somewhere
It's mentioned, the government can choose instead of clothing, wine, tracks, whatever they need.
Is he the guy that walked out?
Yeah, maybe that's what they decided while he was gone. You're not supposed to grab, you don't get a monkey, yeah.
I remember reading in there.
Yeah, I mean, there's this memorandum of things.
Yeah, like I said, it came out today.
For each chief recite the Canadian address distinguishing the braves and the councillors of each chief address and principles of the braves and councillors of each chief. They are, but this is the memorandum at the end that came after the actual treaty.
Okay.
And yet, for each chief, except Yellow Quill, a monkey. The braves and councillors of each chief, except Yellow Quill, a monkey. Poor Yellow Quill, maybe
But I
he
don't
wanted,
know
but
what kind of
you think he'd get something else?
That's all they're
One and two.
Right. For each of the ones signed address distinguishing
Yeah.
except Yellow Quill Buggy.
Yeah.
Except Yellow Quill Buggy.
1975, they have to, they're told to pay up.
And even then, the animals
like
and
me.
their issues.
Yeah, it's like me claiming that I speak
Still belong to the
pure,
government.
but people looked up.
Yes.
But they allowed for the use of the buggies to be the property being used to do it. Poor Yellow Quill really got hit.
Yeah. Yeah, instead of 15. Yeah, we're supposed to just do it right now, but yeah. For now, we said we'd do 3 later. So what is the other things? Peace and land and else to the First Nations. Their obligations to
Just one paragraph to, where's the other one?
I mean, maybe this is where,
To observe the treaty, to maintain perpetual peace, and not to interfere with the property.
to conduct and behave themselves as good and loyal subjects of Her Majesty.
It was all in there, I haven't had a chance.
How we say the local shall be allowed to introduce or sold all laws now enforced or after the enacting of the first reserves or Indians.
I think the phrase is.
Inhabiting the reserves or anything else on the center or northwest territories from the evil influence.
I just do like a pancake, like a cheddar.
They and abide by the law, which is actually probably important. If you're saying you're going to make your right? That's what that means.
And that's also peace and the good order.
Yeah. But it's sort of,
They will not molest personal property.
Well, yeah, it's actually weird because the 7 kilograms is part of the claim, and are all the islands along the border.
okay, so what I wrote down was peace, both with the Crown and with other First Nations. Obviously, the whole land. And agreeing to obey Canadian law, which in some way, I mean, when we're talking about sovereignty, if we're agreeing to obey some other country,
Okay, so how are we doing on this?
actually is probably.
1 minute or? Oh, one question.
They're very similar.
So
160 acres
This is
per
what,
family,
he's one of our
2
postulates in the
person,
free
pool,
school.
no liquor,
That's an iPad.
They are.
$15.
Sorry. Okay, all right, we'll take a couple of minutes to deal with a couple of things before we get started. The question that Brian and Simon just asked me was, who are these Chippewa? And I said, well, they're Ojibwa. And they said, well, who are the Ojibwa? And I said, oh, there's the Anishinaabe. Okay, we're getting into the complexities of the various terms that are used historically here and how they're pronounced. Okay, and so the Chippewa that it's talking about in there are in fact Anishinaabe. Okay, that's who they are.
Otherwise known as the Ojibwe.
Otherwise known as the Ojibwe, otherwise known as the Chippewa. Okay, and if you speak Cree, I'm sure there's an even ruder word for it. In Inuktitut, they're the Lausde, but which is not very nice, by the way. Okay, so let's start with the let's start on the easy side. What's the First Nations of obligations to the Crown? The first one.
First Nations obligations to the Crown.
To the Crown.
All the land.
The land. All right.
Yes.
All right. So that famous, what is called the surrender clause.
Yes.
You hereby cede, surrender, etc., etc., etc. That is the extinguishment clause. Okay, and you should all underline it 3 times and reread it and memorize it, because that is the clause which the Canadian government, up until about 10 years ago, insisted had to go into any land claims agreement. They changed their mind about 10 years ago. They changed the language to something wonderful called clarification. They want to clarify the ownership of the land, which means exactly the same thing, but it's a politer word. So underline that, because that's the extinguishment clause. That's the way the government reads it. And so the land is ceded and surrendered to the Crown. Now, what happens immediately after in the agreement, in the treaty? What's going on around in there? It identifies the territory, what ground is covered, and that is always one of the issues in any treaty, is what land is being ceded. Okay, and they're usually fairly careful to define that land. Okay, now the problem is, well, there's all sorts of problems with that. One of which is that doesn't quite work with the First Nations notions of boundaries. Okay, and so they're very carefully drawing lines on the land, but those lines may not be particularly meaningful. What do they do immediately after that? We're still on land.
They assign lands.
They assign the reserve lands. Okay. Now in Treaty 1 and Treaty 2, they actually designate and specify where the reserve lands are. And in the later treaties, they simply say there's going to be, well, depends, 160 acres per family of 5 or 640 acres per family of 5. Why 160 acres, by the way? Come on, all you Winnipeggers know that.
Quarter section.
The quarter section. Why a quarter section? Well, one person can plow with a horse.
Oh,
Yeah.
What was that? Sorry?
One person can plow with a horse. It is a quarter section. That's why it's a quarter section. You didn't know that, did you? Go check. I don't know. I'm not a farmer. I'm an academic. They define the reserves very carefully. Okay. As I said, later on they leave the defining the reserves to later, but in these ones they define them carefully. Just a question. Are those reserves unceded First Nations territory? Or does the Crown, out of its benevolence, give some land back to the First Nations,
I'm not even sure they give it back.
having ceded it?
We lay it aside and reserve it for their use.
That's right. Naturally, it's user-friendly.
Well, but it's for Her Majesty's Indian subjects.
Yes.
So they've already, the sovereignty's gone.
It's all
Before you
gone.
even get there.
Yeah. One of the problems with understanding reserved lands, and I just wanted to point this out, and we'll take the break now. One of the problems with understanding reserved lands is First Nations do understand reserved lands as unceded territory. That is basically what I refer to politely as the donut hole theory of land ownership. That all the land except this land was ceded. The Crown has always understood it the other way around, which is what you just said, that all the land was ceded and the Crown, out of its benevolence, gave back for their use certain amount of land. I want you to get into your head these very, very different understandings around such things as reserved lands, because of course that leads to many, many of the conflicts that we have in this day and age, and it comes out of the wording and the structure of those treaties. Okay? So those reserve.
But I've heard the argument that the wording is all, all we've got, and it's all came from the Crown. But there is another understanding that was the oral understanding at the time.
Yep.
And that's more and more being taken into account.
We're going to get back to that because there is a problem with Treaty 1. Well, a really big one. That's part of the issue, is what the oral agreements were as opposed to what the written agreements were. And up until again, well, the funny thing about it is, even with Treaty 1, the Crown had to concede on the oral agreement piece. Okay. Some of it. All right. Take 10 minutes, get some coffee, get some... Well, we'll give you 10. We'll go to 5 after. Well, that clock's more or less right.
Really? I was worried about it.
Holy mackerel.
Maybe something else.
I've never done it before.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the only one.